Hello, I'm Kerry O'Shea Gorgone with Appfire, and I am so excited to be here for GitKon 2022. Today, we're going to talk with Eric Amodio. You may have heard of him. He's an entrepreneur, innovator, architect, and full stack engineer, the creator of GitLens and CTO of GitKraken, and previously held engineering leadership roles on the VS Code team at Microsoft and CodeStream. Eric, thanks so much for joining.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So when you were a kid, did you fantasize about being a CTO someday? Like when you played with your action figures? How did this happen?
No. I mean, I think, when I was a kid, hardware was my go-to. So like, having electronic Legos, I loved Legos. And so computers were like, electronic Legos that you can sort of tear apart and put together. So I loved doing that. And, the software side kind of came just from tinkering, but I never really love that too much compared to the hardware of actually building it. But as tools got more advanced, there, I saw Visual Basic, and Visual Basic was sort of like the game changer for me. It was like, moving from this environment where I couldn't really imagine what I wanted and make things happen to where now I can sort of like, build out the things in my head and really just like create things. And so that just really made me get hooked and really switched the thing from hardware to software. So
when was your first exposure? Like when did you realize coding was a thing?
From a young age, my dad was a programmer working on PCs. So, I would sit even as like, as young as 5, sitting with him, watching what was doing. And, at the time too, he was working on a, sort of like text-based terminal on a PC. And we also had one of the new Macs, the original Macintosh. And I liked playing with that because it had, icons and things you could see and click on. Whereas like, this archaic computer of just, text. And it's funny, now I write most stuff in text and it's come full circle. But yeah, I mean, that's when I sort of really started liking that and then playing with, just seeing how things work. I love taking stuff apart. So it's like, just seeing how my computer worked and, seeing what I can make the internals do.
So what about open source? When did you make that leap?
Far, far later. I just love the whole idea of open source. I mean, it's just, computing, even, when I was younger, it was like, everything was just open. There, there wasn't things that were closed nearly as much.
They didn't know how yet.
Yeah. And it was like, everything was sort of shared and you're like built on this idea of standing on the shoulder of giants. And, we've been really moving away from that where I'm like, I just love the open source movement. It's like kind of bringing that back and really moving us all forward rather than, lots of little silos of stuff.
When did you realize it was a career? Like you could actually make a career out of this?
In college is where I switched from wanting to, create CPUs. That was my passion. Like I really liked the hardware side. But, I basically created some little apps that became really popular of just, freeware, shareware type things. The code wasn't open because there was no place to really like open code at that point in time. But, that's where I got bit by the bug of like really wanting to create software and create things and tools that people liked. And so, yeah, I switched and, started looking at careers in doing, software to where I can create things. When I first had grown up, it was like tools and stuff were really at the forefront, and then that sort of faded. And then really where it brought me back was when VS Code came out. I really just, sort of fell in love with the tool. It sort of reinvigorated to me, sort of that ethos of, building tools and really having extensible things that everyone can hack upon, then it becoming open source. That's what really drove me back to really, into the Microsoft ecosystem again and wanting to work on that team. So it was really that team that drew me back or drew me in.
So then GitLens, was that something you felt like you needed personally, and it just turned out a whole bunch of other people, like 17 million other developers also needed it? Or
yeah, it's been a crazy road. Yeah, I mean, it started out, it started out kind of twofold. One, I wanted to play with, VS Code just launched their extensibility model and I loved VS Code. TypeScript was just coming out and I wanted to play more with TypeScript. So it was like, okay, well, I can do both. So let me just create something. I saw some features that Visual Studio had, these code lens where you can tell about like the author about Git. So it's like, oh, maybe I can do the same thing in VS Code. So I did that. And it's like, okay, this is kind of cool. So put that out. And then it was more about, keep building on the tool that, I wanted to use, wanted stuff out of VS Code to help me do the things that I did on a day-to-day basis, and also to help my team understand Git better, and just, use it more effectively. And so it really just, sort of snowballed from there. Just, having passion for building tools and having passion for like the things that I wanted to get done and make my life easier, and just kept building them in. And, over time it turned into a beast.
Well, at what point, like I've heard musicians say the first time they heard their song played on the radio or in a grocery store or something, it's like the moment they felt like, oh, this is a thing. When did you feel like, oh, GitLens is a thing?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's, a few times where it's been like, I've heard it on, on Twitter is memes, where it's like, like GitLens calling you out because, sort of like the Git blame thing is like, most of the time when you're looking at who did this, it's you, prior you. So like, it's, hearing GitLens called me out and stuff like this, and a lot of memes were like, whoa, okay, this has sort of changed how I thought about that. But I think from the other side was also just seeing GitLens in, a few different Microsoft keynotes were quite incredible. So that was a marked difference.
The rare self-burn, you made it possible. So what do you think was the feature set or approach that led to it being so popular? Like what was the secret sauce?
I think it's a few different things. I mean, I think, being early in the space just helps, right? Your first mover type advantage. But I think one of the big things is really about, you can install GitLens and you get passive value. You don't have to do anything. So right then and there, you install it, and then it's going to show you information that helps you look and understand the code that you're seeing. So I think that's a big point. And then you can sort of ease into using more and more of the product. And then the other thing too is a movement in developer space and even in VS Code is like, having these really small tools that do one thing, and you have to combine all these tools together to create a cohesive experience. I really went the other way with GitLens on like, doing more of kitchen sink, but making sure that it was, more pay for play, so that like, you weren't penalized performance wise if you didn't use these features. These features would only, have a cost if you, were to take advantage of them, enable them, just because of discovery and just usability into coming into these things, like getting installed is another barrier.
So what's next for GitLens?
Still want to build it out, as, just, really tackle the Git parts, right? Just make Git more accessible. I mean, that's, sort of its tagline is, Git supercharged. And, so it's like basically making the power of Git more accessible to everyone. GitLens really doesn't sort of, I mean, I don't think it sort of fully delivers on that for the novice, right? So, it helps. I mean, it's way more accessible than Git is by itself, but there's a lot more that we can do to help and educate that to make these things easier. I mean, it does more about like providing you more power there, but we also want to provide some more simplicity. But then we'll also be adding on with just tackling more of the developer productivity space. Is, like really just trying to, help you understand the code better, and then, develop that code more effectively and easier.
So no pressure, but like, what do you think is going to happen with Devtools in general in the next like year or so?
I mean, I think, with Devtools, I think we'll start seeing a shift from, a lot of local tools to more cloud-based things. I mean, I think things like, VS Code Dev and GitHub Dev are sort of like, sort of showing where stuff can go, and there's, Stack Blitz and others that are, are showing what you can do in the browser from anywhere. I think those things are really interesting. And then you have the, the full cloud environments like Codespaces and Gitpod, which I think you're going to start seeing more and more of as we do that. So I think that shift will continue. I'm not saying it will replace local. I think it will eat a significant portion of it, but there will always be the time for that local development as well. But I think just getting in, I think it will be a big boom for open source, because you don't have to go and set anything up with like dev containers or these other things. Like, this stuff can be just spun up completely for you, ready to go, make your change. You don't need to worry about your environment and contribute back. I think that will sort of lower the barrier for getting people into trying new things, into stacks that they may not be used to, or setups that they're not familiar with, to make that really much more accessible.
So the other buckle up.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other big piece for Devtools is going to be AI. Seeing tools like Tab9 and GitHub Copilot are just scratching the surface on what we'll be seeing. And it's a real double-edged sword. I think AI brings some really awesome power, but it also brings some significant challenges, and just like how it's used, and just like any tool, like it could be really dangerous depending on how it's used. So, but I think we will see that expand dramatically over the next year or two.
If you could offer some advice for developers, what advice would you offer a developer who wants to become an entrepreneur? What do they need to know?
For me, it was about just following my passions. Like, I like problem solving, and being able code for me is like this creative expression. So it's like, I can have these ideas and then create them and put them out there. And I always just love creating things that other people, creating things for me, but that other people would find value in, that sort of thing. So, I mean, a lot of the apps and tools and stuff that I've built over the years have all been sort of like, scratching my own itch on something that I really wanted, and then, adopting and learning from how others use it and that sort of stuff. I think, so like, if you're sort of authentic to what you're trying to create and you're passionate about that, then you can go from there. The other side is, try a lot of things, because it's like, your one thing is not gonna likely take off. If you're just trying one, there's, I've built many different tools in many different spaces, and GitLens miraculously took off. I got very lucky, but there's so many other tools that didn't necessarily hit that adoption, but they still have value for their communities and that sort of stuff.
Your B-side tools.
Yeah, exactly.
What about open source in particular? So what would you say to a developer who wants to start their own open source project?
Do it. And, I would say, like, don't shy away from it too. I mean, like when I started, open source wasn't a thing, so they stayed closed. But then, when I moved into sort of VS Code and other space, like, I just put stuff out there. I was worried too, is like, what people are going to think with this, code I'm just throwing out there. Is it good? Is it bad? Am I going to get judged on it? It's like a worry you worry about, but it's not a thing that actually happens after. Like, once you do it, like nobody, you don't have that issue. So, I mean, I think it's just like putting stuff out there, trying it. Don't expect like you're going to throw some code up there and everyone's going to come running to help and that sort of stuff. But you can build community either organically or just try to encourage the community, by helping lay out what things you want help on and that sort of stuff. But I would definitely recommend doing it. I love open source.
I was just thinking, if I put some code out there, people would definitely come running to help me. They'd be like, "Oh, honey, get a different job." Maybe just interview people. Stick with that. Eric Amodio, thank you so much. Stick around because there is so much more to come for GitKon 2022.